Hey guys, Into the End here, back for another Eternal video. It is now a new month. We're in the year 2018. As it is tradition for us at the beginning of the month, we're going to try and make a gimmicky, a janky, gimmicky brew. And today I have a sweet one for you. I have two versions of the deck. I'll start with the most recent version. And I've teased this deck before in a previous video. Basically, it is a Azurite Prixis means to an end deck that really looks to just mill yourself out and killing your opponent with means to an end. Both of these cards have some synergy with each other in a deck like this, where my primary outlet for triggering both of these cards, these meme cards, is the Stone Scar Scrapper. When you sacrifice 2 Grenadins, you would trigger the Azurite Prixis twice, milling yourself, and then you gain 2 life, which would trigger then the means to an end. So together, these 2 cards would trigger both pieces, whichever piece you have in play, and allows you to mill your own deck, dumping more Grenadins into your void, and then eventually you would hopefully draw into either Gear Cruncher, or you would mill it, and then you can use Dark Return or Smuggler's Stash to bring back the Gear Cruncher, which would then give you basically an infinite supply of Grenadins to then sack to the Scrapper. And that will mill yourself out very, very, very quickly. This version of the deck has alternate win conditions. You could actually just attack your opponent until they die. So if you're playing a really slow deck, or someone that has a control deck that stumbled on power, or an aggressive deck that stumbled, whatever the reason is, you can actually kill someone by just attacking them with your 1/1, 2/1, 2/2 units. Because you do make quite a few of them with Assembly Line and sacking the Slumbering Stone, etc. The Disassembler can also eventually kill your opponent if given enough time, but there's only one in the deck, and I'll tell you why that is the case later on. There's also a third win condition, which is with the Bloodrite Callus, because you do make a lot of units and you can bring them back many times. You can actually make a very large Callus that you can then bring back with Smuggler Stash and then do it again. So I have actually made a 24/24 a Bloodrite Callus before with this deck. It's very rare because you only have 1 copy. If you do mill it yourself, you do have to draw into a Smuggler Stash to bring it back. So it's really rare, but it is just a funky win condition that it only took up 1 card slot. And sometimes against really controlling decks like that new Temporal Time deck, unless they have a disjunction for you right off, right when you cast this could kill him in 2 turns. So it's not a bad win condition. Very good against blue-black control as well, Felon control. So anyway, let's take a look through this deck, and we'll go through some of the card choices. There are many different ways to build this deck, and I came up with at least 3 or 4 different versions. I tried them all out over the last 2 weeks, and I think this one is the most consistent, and I have been able to pull off the combo the most. So, starting at 0, the Azurite Prixis is basically what this deck was sort of built around, even though it is less effective than means to an end. Because gaining life is actually a little bit easier than having a whole bunch of units die. That's the biggest problem. You have to have a deck that is full of units to use this. But if you're full of units, then what is the payoff for using this card? That's kind of an odd one. So 2 Combust is just because this deck does need a little bit of removal. You do need to get rid of very problematic unit targets that kill you very quickly, that has Overwhelm, for example. If a unit doesn't have Overwhelm, you have chump blockers for days. But if they have Overwhelm, like a World Bearer Behemoth, for example, it will kill you in 3 or 4 turns. So you do need some removal. You need to remove a very aggressive, high attack flying units that will kill you very quickly. And you also need to get rid of things like Steward of the Past and Statutory Maiden, which also destroys your entire deck. So a couple of copies of removal in 2 Annihilate and 2 Combust. The Annihilate is obviously good against the mono-colored Overwhelm units like the World Bearer Behemoth. And the Combust is basically good against anything. 3 Dark Returns, because you do need ways to recur key cards in your deck once they have been milled into your void. So the drones are self-explanatory. It makes 2 drones, perfect for sacking. It's also very good in the early game. It also gives you an avenue of winning the game without relying on your combo. Some decks are really slow, and if you go turn 1 drone, turn 2 spark hatcher, turn 3 assembly line, sometimes that's enough. You just attack them until they die. Slumbering Stone is just a lot of value. You can use it with Combust, you can sacrifice it with Devour, you can sacrifice it to the Callus or the Scrapper, you can block with it, it makes a 2-2. It's just an overall very good value card in your deck that you can play on turn 1. So 2 Annihilate, I already talked about that. 4 Dark Wisp, obviously this is just a thing that's there for killing and dying, and you draw a card. This deck does have a lot of variance problems. The more card draw you have, the better, which is why we have 4 Wisp and 4 Devour here. It helps us get to the cards that we really need. Like, basically just the Stone Scar Scrapper is the most important card in the deck, so we want to get to that card every game. There is 1 copy of Disassembler in this deck because a lot of people nowadays play with Waystones. If they are primal, they're just gonna passively have Aegis, and the Aegis will completely beat Means to an End. So you have 1 card in your deck that if you absolutely have to, you can Dark Return it or Smuggler Stash this, put it into play, sack something just to trigger your opponent's Aegis so that they can die to Means to an End. So just 1 copy. It's not really there as an actual win condition on its own by killing people with the damage. It's really there just to trigger Aegis. 4 Spark Hatchers because they're like Dark Wisp. They die. It's a pseudo card advantage because when they die, you presumably got some advantage or value out of their death, and then you still leave behind a 1/1, which still can be sacrificed. So that's a lot of value in this deck. 3 Amber Acolyte because this deck does go up to 5, 6, and 7 power, and it has no other ways to grab power. I didn't want to use Seek Power because it's a spell. I have plenty of things happening in the first couple of turns anyway. The reason why Amber Acolyte is good is because it's a unit, and I can attack, block with it, and I can also sacrifice it. So it has a lot more synergy with the sacrificing payoff cards of this deck. Assembly Line is just one of the best sacrifice fodder producing card. Unfortunately, it is not a grenadine itself as a spell, so if you milled it and discarded it from your deck, it doesn't count towards the Gear Cruncher, but that's usually not a huge problem. Even if you Gear Cruncher back with 3 or 4 grenadines, that's already pretty good. So you don't need to come back with like 12, for example. I already talked about the 1 copy of Bloodright Callus. It's just an alternate win condition, and sometimes surprises your opponent. Sometimes you do get draws where you just go turn 1 drone, turn 2 hatcher, turn 3 assembly line, and you turn 4 Bloodright Callus for like a 10/10, and your opponent just scoops because his deck can't deal with it. So it's actually pretty neat. 3 copies of Means to the End instead of 4 because this card is just useless until we first have the Stone Scar Scrapper in play. So this card is heavily dependent on you drawing the Scrapper, so I don't want to run 4 copies of it. And then 1 copy of Smuggler Stash just to bring things back if I have to. For example, if I have to bring back an extra copy of the Means to an End. Actually, sorry, I can't bring it back. For example, if I mill the Callus and I absolutely need it back, it's the only way to bring it back. And then bringing back a couple of units in this deck is usually pretty good, especially if those units are Stone Scar Scrappers and Gear Crunchers. And then 2 copies only instead of the 3 or 4 that I used to run in this deck. I realized that this card gets stuck in my hand a lot, and having this in your deck that has only 25 power sources plus 3 acolytes, having this in your opening hand is miserable because chances are you will lose that game and you will never get to play it. Between the milling and then the Dark Returns and the stash and the 2 copies, you do get this card reliably in the mid game, and usually when you get your Stone Scar Scrapper engine going, you do have a pretty high odds of getting the Gear Cruncher when you need it. So I think 2 copies is okay. Yeah, and then the power base is pretty shaky. We have no seats. It's all banners because we have plenty of units, and one of the reasons why we don't play with the seats is because we have very few actual sigils. We only have a total of 5 basic sigils, so that you can have something to grab with the Amber Acolyte. But other than that, yeah, I think if we play with seats, they will always come into play depleted. Whereas with the banners, often enough it will come into play non-depleted after the first 2 or 3 turns. That's it. This is the deck. It's a gimmicky deck. It's not super powerful. It's awesome when it works, and it's really, really fun when it works. And when a combo goes off, it's super exciting. But it doesn't happen all the time. It's obviously not the most consistent deck because you need all the right pieces and you need to draw the right pieces in the right order. But this is one of the more consistent versions of the deck. There are other versions that I've made, and this original one, which is a lot less consistent but a lot more explosive. This deck has more copies of Gear Cruncher, but it also runs Mask of Torment for an additional win condition. For all the life gain you get off of the Stone Scar Scrapper, you would trigger the Mask of Torment a bunch of times and get into your 2020 Tormentor pretty quickly. So it's just this is the ultra gimmick. It has 3 meme cards. It has Mask, it has the Prixis, and it has the Means to an End all in the same deck, which I thought was super exciting. But after many, many games, I realized that the Mask of Torment almost never does anything, because if you have the Stone Scar Scrapper combo going, you would end up winning the game with Means to an End usually, and you don't actually get to use the Mask of Torment that much. And if you don't draw the Stone Scar Scrapper, the Mask of Torment does nothing because you have no other way of gaining life except for the random Devours and Piercing Grease. But that's clearly not enough. You need a repetitive source of life gain for this card to be good. This deck, this version even runs Piercing Greaves for a little more lifesteal and also a little bit of early game damage. And then when it comes back, you draw cards. So it's just another way of drawing cards. And then it runs the full 4 copies of Means to an End, and it even runs 4 copies of Tumblebang, which will give you the extra power to boost out the Scrapper and the Gear Cruncher earlier than turn 5 and 7. Because if you play this on turn 3 and you can combust it yourself on turn 4, you get 2 additional power, which will then allow you to power out the Scrapper. In the even more all-in version of this deck, I play with Combustion Cells, and then with Combustion Cell, you can literally play this the Combustion Cell on turn 2, the Tumblebang on turn 3, and on turn 4, you can sack it for 5 additional power. So you have access to 9 power on turn 4 if you have those sequences, if you have the right sequence of cards. And on 9 power, you can actually play a Stone Scar Scrapper, play another unit, and sack it all in the same turn. But that's like the perfect scenario, and it happens very, very rarely, which is why I removed the Combustion Cell, because one of the problems with this deck is a lack of card draw if you don't have the Scrapper. Everything that you want to do is completely dependent on having a Scrapper in play so that you can draw more cards to feel the sacrifice. So with the Combustion Cell, if you don't have the Scrapper in play, sacrificing your own units for a temporary boost in power will often result in a board state where you don't have enough units, and you're just dying to draw into a Scrapper or Gear Cruncher, and if you don't, you lose the game because you've sacked all your units. So I've decided to stay away from that because it's too all-in. It's glorious when it works, but it works almost never. So anyway, this is the most recent version of the deck, and when we go into the gameplay videos, just so you know, the gameplay videos has been recorded over the course of 2 weeks. So there are going to be some number of gameplay videos that uses the original version of the deck, and then there are some that will use this current version, and I'll let you know before the video starts. All right, this deck is super fun. It's super gimmicky. I highly recommend not using this in competitive. When I used this in ranked last month, and I think I dropped about 400 ranks in a week. But of course, that's while I was tweaking the deck, so I had a lot of problems with it early on. But in this current version, I still don't think it's quite competitive enough for you to go and climb ladder. But I think in casual game, this is really, really fun to play. All right, thanks for watching.